The autumn of 1939 drifted into winter, and the great armies of Europe sat, watching each other across a line drawn in the earth of northern France. They called it the phony war, the drôle de guerre, the Blitzkrieg. A war declared, but not yet fought. On one side, the German Wehrmacht, coiled and confident after its surgical dismemberment of Poland, rested on its laurels, its panzer divisions honing a new and terrible form of warfare. On the other, the French and the British, inheritors of the Great War's victory, waited behind the imagined security of the Maginot Line, a concrete dragon whose tail failed to cover the crucial sector of the Ardennes forest. The Allied strategy was fundamentally defensive, a reaction to the trauma of 1914. They would hold the line, blockade Germany, and wait for the Nazi regime to collapse under economic pressure. It was a strategy of patience, a 1918 strategy for a 1940 world. The British Expeditionary Force, or BEF, was a small professional army, but it was not equipped or trained for the kind of war that was coming. Its commanders, like its political masters, were men whose military education was steeped in the attritional battles of the Somme and Passchendaele. They understood trenches, artillery barrages, and the slow, grinding advance. They did not fully grasp the revolution that had taken place in the German army, a revolution built on the synthesis of the internal combustion engine and the radio. This new doctrine, the Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, was not just about tanks. It was a philosophy. It emphasized speed, surprise, and the relentless exploitation of a breakthrough. It aimed to create psychological paralysis by striking deep into the enemy's rear, severing communication lines and sowing chaos. While French and British generals still relied on telephones and dispatch riders, German panzer commanders led from the front in radio-equipped command vehicles, capable of redirecting the entire axis of an attack in minutes. The German plan for the invasion of France, codenamed Fall Gelb, or Cast Yellow, was a masterpiece of operational audacity. The initial version was a conventional plan, a rehash of the old Schlieffen plan, involving a primary thrust through the Netherlands and Belgium. But a German plane crash in Belgium in January 1940 compromised this plan, forcing a radical rethink. The new vision came from General Erich von Manstein. He argued for a daring gamble. The main armored thrust should go through the Ardennes, a region of dense forest and rolling hills considered impassable for a large mechanized army by the Allied High Command. This sickle cut, or Sickelschnitt, would punch through the weakest point in the Allied line, held by second-rate French divisions, and race for the English Channel, cutting off the elite of the Allied armies, including the BEF, which had dutifully marched north into Belgium to meet the expected main German attack. On May 10, 1940, the phony war ended with a terrifying suddenness. German forces smashed into Holland and Belgium, drawing the Allied armies forward, just as Manstein had predicted. But this was a feint. The real blow came in the south. 7 panzer divisions, the largest concentration of armor the world had yet seen, under the command of men like Heinz Guderian, plunged into the Ardennes. The French cavalry divisions sent to screen the forest were brushed aside. By May 12th, Guderian's Trentin Panzer Corps had reached the Meuse River at Sedan. The French Ninth Army, holding this sector, was a fragile instrument. Its men were poorly equipped, its leadership demoralized. On May 13th, under a terrifying aerial bombardment from Stuka dive bombers, the Germans forced a crossing. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical one. The French command structure, centralized and slow, was incapable of reacting to the speed of the German advance. Communications broke down. Rumors spread like wildfire. The German spearhead, once across the Meuse, did not stop to consolidate its gains. It raced west. The sickle cut was in motion. Day after day, the panzer divisions drove deeper into France, their flanks covered by infantry, but their spear point, a razor-thin column of tanks and motorized infantry. They were a rapier thrust into the soft underbelly of the Allied armies. For the men of the BEF and the French First Army in the north, the reality of the situation dawned with sickening slowness. They were engaged with what they thought was the main German force in Belgium, but reports began to trickle in of German tanks far to their south, moving west with alarming speed. The strategic map in the headquarters of Lord Gort, the commander of the BEF, told a horrifying story. The German panzers were creating a corridor to the sea, and the Allied armies in the north were being herded into a pocket. Gort was a man of immense personal courage, but he was isolated. Communication with his French counterparts was sporadic and confused. He was receiving contradictory orders from London and from the French High Command. A desperate attempt was made to sever the panzer corridor from the south. On May 21st, a small force of British and French tanks launched a counterattack near the town of Arras. The British Matilda tanks, slow but heavily armoured, proved impervious to standard German anti-tank guns. For a few hours they caused panic and chaos in the flank of Erwin Rommel's 7th Panzer Division. Rommel himself was forced to personally direct the fire of his division's 88 mm anti-aircraft guns, the only weapon capable of stopping the Matildas in a ground role. The attack ultimately failed due to a lack of coordination and support, but it had an outsized psychological impact on the German High Command. Spooked by the vulnerability of their extended spearhead, they became momentarily cautious. This flicker of hesitation, this brief pause, was the first of a series of seemingly small events that would have profound consequences. Gort, seeing the hopelessness of the situation and the inability of the French to mount a coordinated counteroffensive, made a fateful decision. On May 23rd, against the orders of his political masters, he abandoned any further attempts to break out to the south and ordered his forces to begin a fighting withdrawal to the north towards the sea. He had one objective: to save his army. The retreat was a nightmare. The roads were clogged with refugees, a human tide fleeing the German advance. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, had command of the skies, and its bombers and fighters strafed the retreating columns relentlessly. The situation became even more desperate on May 28th, when King Leopold III of Belgium surrendered his army. This opened a massive gap on the eastern flank of the BEF, forcing them to stretch their already thin lines to cover the coast. The pocket was shrinking daily. The BEF, along with remnants of the French First Army, was being squeezed into a small perimeter around the port of Dunkirk. Calais had fallen on May 26th, Boulogne the day before. Dunkirk was the last port, the last hope of escape. And then, on May 24th, something inexplicable happened. The German panzer divisions, on the very outskirts of Dunkirk, with the BEF seemingly at their mercy, were ordered to halt. The infamous Halt Order, issued by Hitler, has been a subject of intense debate ever since. Was it, as Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, had promised, to allow his air force to deliver the final death blow? Was it the caution of generals like Gerd von Rundstedt, worried about the marshy terrain of Flanders and the memory of the Arras counterattack? Or was it a calculated political gesture from Hitler, a belief that allowing the British to escape would make them more amenable to a peace treaty? Whatever the reason, the German armour stopped. For 48 crucial hours, the tanks that had raced across France sat idle, while the British and French inside the Dunkirk perimeter worked frantically to organize a defense. In a quiet office deep in the chalk cliffs of Dover, Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay had been planning for this contingency since May 19th. The operation was codenamed Dynamo. The name, contrary to later myth, did not come from the room in which it was planned, but was simply a code word. Ramsay's initial assessment was grim. On May 26th, the day Dynamo was officially ordered to begin, the hope was to evacuate perhaps 45,000 men over 2 days before the Germans overran the port. The first day was a disaster. Only 7,669 men were lifted from the harbour. The harbour itself was under constant, ferocious attack. Stuka dive bombers, with their terrifying sirens, plummeted out of the sky, dropping bombs with deadly accuracy. The harbour facilities were wrecked, the oil tanks set ablaze, and the town of Dunkirk was reduced to a smoking ruin. The shallow draft of the beaches meant that the large Royal Navy destroyers and transport ships could not get close enough to shore. Men would have to be ferried out from the beaches to the ships waiting in deeper water. But there were not enough small naval craft to do the job. It was then that the call went out. An emergency broadcast requested all owners of self-propelled pleasure craft between 30 and 100 feet in length to contact the Admiralty. From the boatyards and yacht clubs of the English coast, an extraordinary flotilla began to assemble. Fishing trawlers, cockle boats, paddle steamers, private yachts, lifeboats, any vessel that could float and move under its own power was requisitioned and sent across the channel. These were the little ships of Dunkirk. Manned by a motley collection of naval reservists, civilian volunteers, and their own owners, they sailed into a war zone. They faced German E-boats, magnetic mines, and the constant threat of the Luftwaffe. The scene on the beaches was a vision of hell. Hundreds of thousands of men stood in long, disciplined lines, stretching from the sand dunes into the surf. They stood there for hours, sometimes days, under a sky buzzing with enemy aircraft. They were bombed and strafed. The sand muffled the explosions but did not stop the shrapnel. The queues would break, men would scatter, and then, with a stoicism that stunned observers, they would reform. The waiting was an agony of patience and terror. The evacuation found an unlikely hero in the form of Dunkirk's eastern mole, a long, narrow breakwater made of wood and concrete that stretched nearly a mile out into the sea. It was not designed for mooring ships, but it was just wide enough for men to walk along and for a destroyer to come alongside if the captain was skillful and brave enough. The mole became the primary artery of the evacuation. Men would march out along its narrow planking, a precarious walkway above the waves, and jump onto the decks of the ships that came alongside. The ships themselves were magnets for the Luftwaffe. They would load as many men as they could, cramming them into every available space, and then run the gauntlet back across the channel. The Royal Air Force was fighting its own desperate battle in the skies above. The soldiers on the beaches, seeing only the German bombers, often felt abandoned, cursing the RAF for its absence. But the battle was being fought further out, over the Channel and inland. The Spitfires and Hurricanes of Fighter Command's No. 11 Group were flying constant patrols, trying to intercept the German bombers before they reached the evacuation zone. The pilots were pushed to the limits of their endurance, flying multiple sorties a day. They were outnumbered, but they inflicted heavy losses on the Luftwaffe, preventing the air attacks from being even more devastating than they were. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, the head of Fighter Command, had to make a terrible choice. How much of his precious and limited fighter force to risk in the skies over France, knowing that the Battle of Britain, the defense of the homeland itself, was surely coming. While the British were being evacuated, the perimeter was held, and held heroically, by the men of the French First Army and a handful of British divisions designated as the rearguard. These men knew that their chances of escape were slim to none. Their job was to fight to the last, to buy time for the army on the beaches. At Lille, the French IV and V Corps fought a delaying action that tied down 7 German divisions, including 3 panzer divisions, for 4 crucial days. At towns like Kassel and Wormhout, British units fought until they were overrun. The defenders of Le Paradis, after surrendering, were massacred by troops of the SS Totenkopf Division, a grim foretaste of the barbarity that would define the war on the Eastern Front. These were sacrifices of the highest order, acts of courage that made the miracle possible. Day by day, the numbers of evacuated men grew, far exceeding Ramsay's most optimistic projections. May 27th, 17,804. May 28th, 47,310. May 29th, the first day the little ships arrived in large numbers, the total jumped to 59,309. The peak was reached on May 31st, when over 68,000 men were brought back to England. The process was a mixture of meticulous naval planning and chaotic improvisation. Destroyers like HMS Sabre and HMS Shikari performed tireless service, making trip after trip. The paddle steamer Medway Queen made 7 round trips and rescued 7,000 men. A Thames riverboat, the Sundowner, owned and skippered by Charles Lightoller, the most senior surviving officer of the Titanic, crossed the channel and packed 130 soldiers onto his vessel, designed for 21. By June 2nd, the perimeter had shrunk to a tiny sliver of land, and the rearguard began to be pulled back. The focus shifted to evacuating the French soldiers who had made the evacuation possible. In the final 2 days, over 50,000 Frenchmen were rescued. On the night of June 3rd, the final ships departed. At 2:23 a.m. on June 4th, Ramsay sent a signal. Operation Dynamo completed. Return to Dover. The final tally was staggering. 338,226 Allied soldiers had been rescued. Of these, about 224,000 were British. The rest were mostly French. It was a miracle of deliverance, born of desperation and courage. But the cost was immense. The BEF had escaped, but it had left almost all of its equipment behind. Nearly 2,500 artillery pieces, 65,000 vehicles, and 500,000 tons of supplies and ammunition were abandoned on the fields and beaches of France. The British Army was saved, but it was an army without weapons. On June 4th, Winston Churchill, who had become Prime Minister on the day the German invasion began, stood before the House of Commons. He did not mince words. He spoke of a colossal military disaster. He warned against recasting the evacuation as a victory. But then, in words that would echo through the decades, he defined the spirit of Dunkirk, the spirit of a nation that had snatched a chance of survival from the jaws of defeat. "We shall go on to the end," he thundered. "We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." Dunkirk was not a victory. It was the result of a catastrophic strategic failure. But it was a deliverance. It saved the core of the British Army, the professional soldiers and experienced NCOs, around which a new, much larger army could be built. It created a powerful myth, the Dunkirk spirit, that would sustain the British people through the darkest days of the Blitz and the long years of war that followed. The German High Command, for its part, was stunned. They had had the British in their grasp and had let them go. The failure to annihilate the BEF at Dunkirk would prove to be one of the great turning points of the war. Britain, battered but not broken, would remain a defiant fortress off the coast of a conquered Europe, a base from which the long and arduous road to victory would eventually be launched. The little ships, returning to their quiet harbors, had carried home an army, and with it, the hope of the free world.